I know you all have questions about this conclave, and we've gathered them all, and we've got some answers, and that ain't blowing smoke on this edition of the Conclave Crew. Welcome to this Arroyo Grande series, the Conclave Crew Vatican edition, episode 5. Can you believe it's been 5? And this series has been brought to us by our friends at Taylor Fergan Capital Management, Faith, Family, and Finances. They're at taylorfergan.com, as well as Floriani, revitalizing sacred music. They're at floriani.org. We have a lot of your questions to get to. Let's convene the crew. Father Gerald Murray, canon lawyer of the Archdiocese of New York, and Robert Royal, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org. And I'm Raymond Arroyo. Go subscribe to the Arroyo Grande podcast wherever you get your podcasts, or you can see the show, Arroyo Grande Show, on YouTube, and like this episode. The cardinals are in the Sistine Chapel conducting rounds of votes as we speak. Look, we could get a new pope any minute, but until then, the world is on smoke watch. Last night, it was also focused on a seagull and the chimney stack at the Sistine for hours. I actually ran into that seagull on my way home last night, and my friend was with me who he saw this, no lie. And they ordered a dove, I guess, of the Holy Spirit, and they got a seagull. Better than vultures, I guess. We have gotten so many questions from you. I want to get right to them. Conclave Crew, are you ready?
Oh, yes.
All right. Okay, here we go. First one for Bob. Will the conclave be looking outside the box for a successor of St. Peter? How about the credentials of Bishop Robert Barron or someone like that?
Well, I love Robert Barron. I mean, he's a controversial figure for some people, but I think he's a very rock-solid guy. He's very well educated, very well spoken, speaks several languages, understands really very deeply, he understands the moment that we're in right now. And it's a very difficult cultural moment as well as it is an internal church moment. But unfortunately, I think this time around, the bets have been laid largely, that the leading candidates are probably going to be among the finalists that we're going to see. Although I think some of the ones like Parolin, who were really at the top at the beginning, their stars have sunk quite a bit. So we may see a surprise, but it's very unlikely that they're going to go outside the box. If what you mean is outside the cardinals,
right? Outside the College of Cardinals. For a minute there, Bob, when you were talking about Bishop Barron's language skills and everything, I thought I'd have to go to Ed Penton and have him update the College of Cardinals report and do an addendum with Barron at the back. Maybe next time we'll do that. One viewer wrote, Father, I seriously doubt that this particular way of voting goes back 2,000 years. Well, I'm going to handle this one. It's called a tradition. It evolved. You know, you can look at the Acts of the Apostles. I did it this morning. In Acts 1, the apostles gather to pray and then vote to cast lots, if you will, to replace Judas. And they choose between two men. Look it up. Over time, that process evolved where you had the priests of Rome, then the cardinals of Rome, then the larger College of Cardinals. By 1274, this form of gathering in a single locked location, cut off from the world, was formalized. Originally in the Quirinal Palace, which it was the seat of the Italian government. Later, that moved to the Sistine Chapel. So it does go kind of back 2,000 years, though it's evolved and the traditions have matured with it. The beauty of the church, I think, Father, is that we bring all of that tradition into the future. We sort of gather it up through the 2 millennia and carry it, to the present moment.
Yeah, it was useful back then. It's useful now. I mean, to depoliticize, let's say, the whole process, there are no speeches being given in the Sistine Chapel, and people's vote is secret. It's not a voice vote where you could try to, look at people and persuade them to go along with you. So, no, it's a very respectful process to let people vote their conscience.
Yeah, and I like that it almost has a wave quality. You know, one candidate rises and then others shift alliances because they're concerned, and suddenly somebody else comes up. There's something, it's mysterious. It's mysterious. It allows the Holy Spirit to operate a bit. Father, this one's for you. Why are, a lady wrote this, I didn't write this. Why are all the cardinals wearing red dresses? Father, is that a Vera Wang or an Omani? Why are they wearing red?
Yeah. Well, it actually comes from Target, tellers, so it's pretty cheap. No, they don't wear dresses. The cassock is not a dress. The cassock is that long garment that the priests wear. It's black for your ordinary priests. And then cardinals get red. They wear, because that symbolizes that they're willing to shed their blood to promote the faith and be faithful to Jesus Christ. So, no, the garment has an elegance to it, I think, Raymond, we would all say. And when you're wearing red ones, where everyone else is in black, it's very striking. They stand out.
Yeah, and the evolution of that is really something. I mean, that goes right back to Roman garb, and I mean, there's a lot of interesting. Again, the church collects up all of these bits and pieces from history and carries it on and preserves it.
Let me throw that in. I mean, yes, in Rome, important people wore purple. Purple was the color of the nobility and the senators, and so the church used that for the bishops. So the bishops wear purple, and the cardinals wear red.
Yeah, and just as a side note, a contemporary cultural side note, one of the most visited Met Gala exhibitions at the Met for the costumes and what do you call that?
Finery.
Fashion, ended up being the year that they focused on the Catholic Church and what it did for fashion. And it was mostly papal regalia and, cardinal and bishop's outfits. It's kind of cool that that's what they were looking at. Anyway, Bob, Maureen asks, is the new Pope allowed to come into the Vatican with his own entourage that he can trust? Interesting question.
Well, look, the Pope is the boss. He can come in with whoever he wants, and presumably he is going to want to have people around him that he can trust. We've talked about this before, that a Pope can't rule a large entity like the Catholic Church on his own, although in this recent papacy, we saw a lot of the usual offices and channels by which the Pope rules were short-circuited. Pope Francis liked himself to make a lot of decisions. But any wise leader of a large group, and in particular, a Pope needs to have a large group, I think, actually, of trusted advisors. So it'll be interesting, as it is when we see like a president, to put together a cabinet, it'll be interesting to see who he brings in along with him. And it's not a matter of being permitted. He's the boss at that point, and he can even reconfigure what the offices are going to be like of the people who are going to help him, as Pope Francis did.
Yeah. No, we are bracing for a big shift here. One way or the other, it doesn't matter who the man is. He inevitably will bring his own sensibility and put his own stamp on this papacy. Father, what happens if a cardinal is elected and refuses the nomination? Someone wrote in our comments. Does the conclave resume voting?
Yeah, that's an excellent question because, yes, in order to become Pope, you have to accept the election. So it's it's similar, if the Pope names an archbishop, let's say the Archbishop of Phoenix or somebody, and the letter comes in and the priest nominates Archbishop of Phoenix says no, then he's not the Archbishop of Phoenix. So likewise, the Pope can say no to the cardinals, and then in that case, they would have to resume voting. Yep, that's the way it is, because it has to be a free choice on the part of the person. And some cardinals may say, I'm not up to this job. They may know that they have an illness that's going to really debilitate them, or they may just say, let's say they elect a man who's 79 years old. Said, I'm 79, I'm not going to have the energy needed to confront the situation of the church. So it would be an act of humility, actually, for that man to say, I'm sorry, I do not accept this election.
Yeah. And then they go back to another round of balloting, which I'm sure can't make them happy. They've got to be, this group wasn't too happy after the long stay in Rome. I can't imagine what they're going through now, sequestered in the Sistine Chapel. All you see is, the only outside you see is the bus taking you back and forth from the Santa Marta house to the Sistine Chapel. Father, can you explain about the three types of cardinals and what they mean? What are those roles, and are they interchangeable, or and can they adapt? Can they change those three types of cardinal designations?
Sure. Yeah. Within the College of Cardinals, there are three ranks or levels: cardinal deacons, cardinal priests, and cardinal bishops. And this reflects the practice going back many centuries in Rome, where you would have deacons, who are the first order of sacred orders, that they were serving in Rome. And actually in Rome, they organized the church in what they called deaconries. And deacons were in charge of charity. So they'd have deacons and you'd have priests who would serve in the different churches. So the Pope would pick some of those deacons and priests to be sort of like important people who would have the right then to nominate and elect the new Pope. Cardinal bishops are, they're from what they're called the sub-Urcarian diocese. So the dioceses that are immediately surrounding the Diocese of Rome, those bishops were called cardinal bishops. And it became the tradition that all of them were then cardinals, and they had a right to vote in the conclave. Now, all of that is now ceased from the point of view of they're not these. Everyone who becomes a deacon, cardinal deacon, is already a priest or a bishop, and likewise cardinal priests or bishops. Same with cardinal bishops. But there within the tradition now. They maintain that, for instance, the leader of the conclave is the cardinal dean, or in his absence, the senior cardinal bishop. So the cardinal dean and the vice dean are both over 80. So Cardinal Parolin, who is the senior cardinal bishop, he is in charge inside the Sistine Chapel of the conclave. And then the cardinal deacon, the senior one, will announce from the balcony the name of the new pope. So there are these roles. And then, of course, like in an organization so ancient, seniority has its role. So the bishops and priests and deacon cardinals all enter according to their rank.
Wow. Yeah, that's cool, the way it's broken up. And again, you see all that history. There again, the church preserving this history. Even when things have fallen away, the classifications, the rank, the tradition remains. Bob, Vatican II, one of our viewers wrote, Vatican II had serious problems, even heresy within, that has not been addressed. What about the heresy of modernism that's devastated the church in the past 60 years? You would say what?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think that Bishop Barron has a good grasp on that. And we just have to recognize that we all live in a culture that is deeply marked by modernism, which is to say a kind of a materialistic, scientific view of the world. I mean, there's nothing wrong with true science and the true study of the physical world, but that has kind of encroached on our understanding of faith, of morals, of what human beings are. Are we just animals, or are we something that go beyond that? And so I think that this is not a cultural question that can be solved very quickly. And some of these ambiguous statements, I would call them, that came out of Vatican II were, of course, exploited by people who wanted to use that modernism to advance progressive causes within the church. Now, in broader cultural terms, lots of people consider us to be in postmodernism right now, which means that the old modernism, that old materialism, scientific materialism, that's not so secure any longer. I mean, we see it in politics, we see it in education. So there's a real opportunity for someone who grasps deeply what's at stake, brings the graces and the power of Christ into a culture that itself now is searching, groping around for what it's going to do. It may take some serious restructuring of how people look back at the council and understand that as well. It's a big task, and it's one that I think the next pope has to undertake, along with all the other things that we've talked about with regard to sexual abuse, to financial problems. That's a longer-term problem, but we really need to get on the case. John Paul and Benedict started the response to it. I think we need to take that forward very vigorously, because in a century or so, we could be in a very different culture unless we do.
Father, here's an interesting question. Can a cardinal vote for himself in a conclave?
A cardinal can vote for himself, except in the runoff, and it's a technicality. So, a cardinal can vote for himself in each round leading up to, I guess it's the 33rd round. So if they haven't elected anybody by round 33, what they do is the top two vote getters enter into a runoff. And the two cardinals who are in that category cannot vote for themselves. So no one could say that they were the deciding vote for themselves. And I think that's a wise decision.
Well, that was kind of a setup for this question that one of our viewers submitted. Who would Jesus vote for in the conclave?
Well,
himself,
the good Lord,
until the runoff.
Number one, the good Lord was not a cardinal, so he's the God incarnate who the cardinals worship and obey. So no, in the free will, in the gift of free will to mankind, God left in the church decisions to be made by us, not by God directly. So we believe in providence and God's help. but we do not believe that, God is voting in each cardinal votes, and hopefully they vote in a godly way. But got to remember, there are a lot of good men in that college, so voting for one and not another doesn't mean you're doing something that offends God.
Yeah, well, when I read that question, I thought if Jesus walks into the Sistine Chapel, I can promise you they'll all vacate. There'll be no need to have a vicar of Christ if
true.
You have Christ, right?
Good point. I should have said that from the start.
We'll wait till he goes back to heaven, and then you have another conclave, I guess. Here's an interesting question, Bob. This lady, she says, I am confused as to how do the cardinals vote on the fourth day? It says they have to take a pause on the fourth day, according to the Constitution of Conclave that John Paul II drafted or wrote, promulgated. Bob, do they take a pause for the full day for prayer and meditation, or only for part of the day?
Yeah, we talked about this the other day, and I think they have some latitude in what they're going to do. They could take the whole day off, they could take the half day off. And I think there's a certain prudence that if people are exhausted or they feel that they kind of have reached an impasse about where the vote is going, maybe it's a good thing to take a whole day. And if it's Sunday and they back off and they have a chance to pray, go to mass and have a little bit of recreation and then come back afterward. But I don't believe there's any requirement that this be a full day or a half day. We'll no doubt find, if it gets to that stage, we'll no doubt find out how much the people who are running the actual conclave feel that they need a break.
Father, why do the cardinals have to change their handwriting when writing their ballot? This viewer said, I heard that they have to disguise their handwriting. Is that true?
It is, because the voting is anonymous. When you submit your ballot, you don't put your name on it. And when the ballots are deposited in the urn, those who are counters are supposed to mix them up. So not like if you can see the last cardinal and he's on the top of the stack, and you take his name out first, everybody know he voted for that person. So no, the goal here is to not allow the individual names or votes to be known, so that it can't be a form of moral persuasion or even kind of like a certain amount of coercion that you have to vote what Cardinal X said. Now, disguising the handwriting presumes that the counters will recognize the handwriting of the others. And in the modern world, very few people send letters by snail mail. They don't write out letters. And email, there's no signature unless you use that automatic signature thing, which is always made up. So no one really, I think, will know the handwriting, but some of them may know the handwriting of each other. So disguising it as best you can. That's just another means to try to preserve the anonymity and privacy of what's happening.
Yeah, and I've known older cardinals who've gone in and they have an infirmani who's a person, basically a nurse, somebody to help them. And they can, if the cardinal can't write, if they have the shakes or are too old, they'll write the name for them and actually do that, which I didn't realize. But those functions, those people, those nurses, if you will, they are allowed in. But they too are under the oath of secrecy. Bob, what could a group of Catholic cardinals do in the case, and I'm reading this, and at the moment of the election of a cardinal who is clearly heterodox or suspected of heterodoxy, between the very brief moment of the proclamation of the result of the vote and the moment when the elected cardinal accepts the office, is there an option that would allow Catholic cardinals to oppose an election on the grounds that the elected man is not Catholic, is not truly papal?
I think the answer, unfortunately, is there's nothing that they can do. That it's kind of like the popular vote in a presidential election or whatever other type of election. If the process has been followed, one hopes that both because of the inspiration of the Holy Spirit and the prudence of the men in the room, that that would not result in somebody who was obviously and openly heretical. That would have been worked out before that. I can't imagine how they would know that at that given moment, but it's a good thing to raise these issues because funny things happen in the course of elections and whatnot. And we know, people. We started out talking about how the conclave has not always been carried out in this form. We've had periods when there's more than one pope, and decisions have to be made about about who's actually the legitimate pope, and there have been long periods of no pope at all. So we tend to see these things the way we see other events on television and through social media. In fact, someone has said this is the first social media conclave,
Yes,
where there's almost instantaneous response to what's happening. And so if people who are watching this see a figure who's elected who they suspect of heterodoxy, they're going to react in their hope that somehow it can be saved. This is a different kind of process. This is a slower, older type of process, and that can be frustrating, but at the same time, it may provide some safeguards.
Next question. What do the cardinals do in between votes, Father? Do they talk amongst themselves? Do they get up and speak? Do they read? Do they pray? What's the protocol for dinners, lunches, and the in-between periods in the Sistine Chapel? I'll let you both talk about that.
Sure. No, well, all of the above. They're once they leave the Sistine Chapel, then they're going to be able to speak to each other. They get on the bus, which takes them that short distance from the Sistine Chapel around the back of St. Peter's over to the St. Martha House. Inside, they can take a walk, around that area where there's a sort of like parking lot area in front of St. Martha's, for better said. And then the Vatican Gardens are up the hill a little bit. They can certainly go in and discuss at dinner. They can also relax with a book. What they can't do is call anybody, send emails, listen to the radio, watch television, watch the Arroyo Grande podcast. They can't do any of that. So, and I
That
guess
was our
they're
shot.
I know, but no, it's they are. It's similar to being on a retreat. Because there are times of prayer and silence, and certainly that's what's happening in the Sistine Chapel. But in fact, those are the times when they can compare notes and say, well, we think Cardinal X is the right one, but he couldn't get enough votes, so now I'm going to go for Cardinal Y. What do you think?
Yeah, that's when the heavy pressure and the politicking sort of begins, Bob. But I was told that they whisper and talk to the people aside them in the Sistine Chapel as well.
Yeah. Look, they're free because they're actually behind kind of a paywall, if we want to put it that way, right? I sometimes worry how much behind anonymity they actually are. I mean, they take all these steps. They bring in security experts to sweep for bugs, but we've seen in the past that such events somehow always manage to leak to a certain extent, if not immediately, then after the fact, and they're not supposed to even leak after the fact. But
right.
Look, this is all to the good. The more that they talk with one another, the more the possibilities are of working out some things, understanding who's who. We keep saying over and over again, they don't know each other very well, and maybe in that circumstance, which is a bit of a pressure cooker. I mean, I think there's the outlet of prayer and relaxation and whatnot, but in that pressure cooker, you may begin to see things about people's characters that will help you to see how they will operate when they're in the pressure cooker of being the Pope.
Yeah. Father, speak to that for a moment. When Pope Francis was elected, suddenly, there was a journalist, Austin Ivory, who came out with a book. He had letter and verse of not only the agreements made before the conclave, but conversations had in the vote count. I mean, today he was sending out the vote count. Oh, at this point, Francis was already up 10 points. I thought this was supposed to be secret under penalty of excommunication.
No, that's actually the canon law. It is supposed to remain secret. You're not supposed to speak about anything concerning the election. Now, that doesn't mean you can't say, I walked in and my seat was uncomfortable because it was a plastic, a wooden bench, rather, that was not a nice seat. Yeah, that's trivia. But you cannot come in and say, I saw Cardinal X get up and then everybody was smiling. And no, you're supposed to keep it all secret. But people do leak. This is one of the sad realities of the modern world, that people do not take oaths seriously. And we see it in courts of law, and now we see it. You're right. There have been many books written about how the voting went in the last papal conclave, and it's stunning. Now, I'll be completely honest here. Pope Francis himself talked about the voting subsequently, and people noted that, wait a minute, you're not supposed to do that. Now, you could say, since he's the lawgiver, he could dispense himself from observing that law post facto. But, the casualness nowadays with which people assume, well, we say that for public consumption, but in reality, we call our journalist friends. That's something I think that needs to be stamped out.
Yeah, Bob, I saw it today. I'm walking home from the Vatican. There are people on the phone after the first vote, and they're relating tallies. And I hear this one's moving up, and that one's in the lead, and this one lost some votes. I'm like, what app are these people on?
Yeah, I've been looking at the Italian press, which is not always reliable. In fact, it's quite unreliable. But they are very reliable in that they convey every rumor that there is floating around, in and around the room at the same time. I mean, there's a story that was told. This is an interesting story by Il Messaggero, that before they closed the doors today, that Cardinal Ray, who gave the homily at the final mass before they processed into the conclave, said to Cardinal Parolin, he used an expression that I've never heard before, auguri doppi. He says, double good fortune. And since he's a leading candidate, the way that the Italians are interpreting this, and Cardinal Ray's a little hard of hearing, so he said it really loudly so that everybody heard it as he was going in. What they heard this as meaning is, I hope you win, number one, but also I hope you do well in managing, because he's also the manager of what's going on inside the room there. So that's the kind of thing that the Italians look at, and they think that maybe it's going to tilt things one way or another. I'm a little skeptical, but it's interesting the way that they read every tiny detail.
Every utterance. Yeah, it is. It's kind of cool. Are you looking for financial management that reflects your deepest values? Taylor Fergan Capital Management actively manages portfolios designed for those who prioritize faith, family, and long-term stewardship throughout their mutual fund, separately managed accounts, or family office accounts. Taylor Fergan Capital, values-driven investing to support your faith, family, and finances. There at taylorfergan.com. Bob, what should the Pope-elect do to help resolve and correct the China deal that remains secretive? One of our viewers writes in.
Oh man, this is a hard question.
I know. Do the Reader's Digest.
Yeah, if it's Cardinal Parolin, it's his baby, so he's going to have to go back on some of the things that he did there. We don't know what's in there, but we do know that the Chinese, they're just running ahead with naming bishops and reforming dioceses and actually changing the way that masses are said inside the church with President Xi's image there, and they're trying to sinicize all religions, and especially the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church has what they regard as a foreign leader. I don't know what they can do. I think the first thing to do is to publish the accord. There aren't supposed to be private accords like this in the modern world. They should publish that. People should be able to know what the details are so they can at least criticize the Chinese if they're doing something they're not supposed to be doing. But I think this is going to take a much more severe approach, and it's going to require them to be willing to confront China. They haven't been willing to confront Cuba and Nicaragua and Venezuela lately, which have been putting a lot of pressure on Catholic priests. But it's not only the matter of a diplomatic arrangement. This is also the life and death of ordinary lay people, priests and bishops in China, and we can't abandon them. We need some vigorous action to rescue them.
You know, Bob, it's interesting you say that. I ran into a few African and South American cardinals, and they were mentioning John Paul II. We need a John Paul II-like Pope because of what you just raised. He did confront Nicaragua. He did confront the Russian regime. He did confront these fascists and demanded religious freedom in them, and brought the moral suasion of the church. I know it's a balancing act, but a fellow like Parolin, I don't think he'll ever roll that back, but I think the next pope has to not only expose it, but roll it back. It's outrageous. Father, which continent besides Europe, one of our viewers writes, is most likely to produce the next pope?
Well, my estimation is it would be Africa. If we get a European this time, who knows how long he'll reign over the church as pope. But, the African church is growing all the time. And the African cardinals, assume great relevance in the life of the church because they represent an area where Christianity is not dying. Sad to say, in Europe, statistically, Christianity is losing numbers and influence in an unimaginable way. If you think at the end of the Second World War, when Christianity was, viewed as the renewal force to try and bring back a continent which had been destroyed by 2 world wars, and look at it today where Christianity is on the run in almost every single European nation. Eastern Europe is a part where there is a revival, but so I think Africa would be the answer to that question would be where the next a pope in now or the future will come from.
Yeah, which wouldn't be the first time. In the early centuries of the church, we had a string of African popes, mostly from Tunisia, right?
Yeah, North Africa. Yeah, they were. The Roman North Africa was a Roman province, so the Christianity spread there.
Yeah, Bob. William asks, why are the older cardinals over 80 not allowed in the conclave, and especially, why not allow them to be involved, given that their knowledge is unparalleled?
Yeah, I think that's a bit of a sore point. But look, you have to have rules about when people can be active in an organization and when they cannot. I mean, it's simply the case in the Catholic Church that bishops at age 75 are supposed to send a letter to the Holy Father presenting their resignation. The Pope can accept it right at that moment, or he can say, well, I want you to stay on. Very often people will stay on. Cardinal Dolan from New York, for example, is past 75, but he hasn't been removed from his position as Cardinal Archbishop of New York. Look, we've all known people over 80 years old. Some of them are very wise. I think of Cardinal Zen, who's just, he's a dynamo. He's still got all his marbles. He's got energy. He's got courage. But how many, and he's over 90.
Yeah, 93.
How many people over 80 would you want to trust to have that degree of lucidity? And if you make an exception for one, why not another? And then you get into a whole quarrel over that. So it's a rule. In some cases, it's probably unjust, but it would be unjust if no matter how you kind of cut it. So you make a decision, and that's how it goes forward.
Yeah, I think it was Paul VI's rule, right, Father?
Yeah. Can I throw in on this one? Yeah, because Paul VI put that rule in place, and it was understood at the time to be an effort to diminish the influence of older, presumably more conservative cardinals in the next papal election. The irony is, of course, that you cannot vote for a pope if you're over 80, but you can be a pope if you're over 80. So, which is more important? Being a pope is more important than voting for one. So if you can do the greater, you can do the lesser. That's the usual principle of law. So I also say the retirement of bishops at 75 is not that was only introduced also after the Second Vatican Council. We got into the managerial mindset of efficiency, I think, which is, remember the managerial revolution after the Second World War? We're going to fix the world's problems by better management. The jury is in on that. It didn't work. Yeah. So I don't think we should have these rules, because I would much rather have Cardinal Zen voting than simply being an advisor to the others, because he's a man of extreme lucidity and experience.
Yeah, and then people look to the elders, particularly if they're venerable like Zen and have been through the fires of, facing down a regime like China and still, waving the flag. Here's, Father, this is one for you. Why can't there be an American Pope?
There can be. It's just, the church exists in history, so historical factors have to be examined, I mean, my colleague here, Bob Royal, has written a whole history of theology in the 20th century. You have to look at the way things develop. Theologians react to secular trends and then challenges and then biblical studies and all the rest. So on a political scene, I would say, what position does America operate in the world? Back in the 1850s, we were a mission territory. Since the Second World War, with a unique dominant power opposing first the communists and now other forces, China and the rest. So I think the idea would be the dominant secular power should not also have one of its members be the head of the church on earth. But I'd be interested in what Bob had to say.
Yeah, Bob, that's the concern, right? You don't want the superpower having the other superpower.
I don't know. I have no
I like the idea. I think
Look,
you're
if you had
running,
the-
Bob. That's why you were talking to all those cardinals this week. You were trying to slip them the bill.
I mean, look, if there were the proper candidate, and some people think that the Cardinal Provost, who's been the head of the bishops, the committee that selects the bishops and spent time in Latin America, is a front runner. He's a possibility, even though he kind of just appeals to some of the Latin Americans because he spent time in Latin America, and of course he's been in Rome a lot. I just don't know what kind of Pope he would be. I think an American who spent more time in America would have a better grasp on a lot of what's going on in the world. It's not necessary that a Pope grasp, geopolitical things. Certainly Pope Francis did not. John Paul did. John Paul happened to be a man who came from a country where he was in the midst of everything that was going on in the world at that moment. But why not? There could be an American at some point. I think at this moment there's a fair degree of anti-Americanism.
Yeah.
And I think the Trump factor would maybe play into that as well, unfortunately. But anybody can become a pope, any person from any country around the world, and we may be surprised even this time around.
Do you feel, as I look out, as I talk to so many of these men, and we all did this week, it seems this is why I kind of, when I heard Prevost and started looking at him and reading and watching interviews, it seems the Pope now, the Pope that everyone collectively is yearning for, whether they give you a name or not, is a sturdy man. John Paul was that sort of sturdy man of faith, who had kind of been through the fires and was ready to complete the mission and declare the gospel in a compelling way that came from a lived experience. Father, am I totally off base? Do you feel that that's sort of where we are now?
I think there's a desire for a strong father figure, and this is where somebody said once, gentleness is a sign of true strength. And I think that's what we all expect from our dads. They lay down the law, but then,
right.
They restrain the punishment to a degree in order to teach us good lessons. So, that's one reason why African cardinals are so attractive. I've dealt with African parishioners in New York. One of my parishes was majority African parishioners. They were French speaking. I have 2 African priests with me now. Africa is a place where Christianity really was light to get people out of the fear of paganism and to bring to them, the true fatherhood of God and brothership in Christ. So I think, that is a very important factor. Now, Africans aren't the only ones who can do that. Again, right. Going back to Cardinal Zen, we're talked about. If there was ever a father figure, it's him. His flock is being persecuted by communists, and he opens his mouth and says, stop. Jimmy Lai.
Cardinal Sarah would also fit the bill. I mean, he faced down a fascist regime down there. Obango, the same. I mean, these people suffer for their faith. Some of the Sudanese bishops, they've got marauding groups of Islamists burning down villages and killing their people. So they know what it means to suffer for the faith in the way that we in the West, I'm going to play golf today. I'm going to skip the mass. Our African brothers and sisters don't understand that approach.
No, and I'll just throw in Nigerian bishops. The cardinals in Nigeria are, as Bob has recently said in a public presentation, no country in the world has suffered as many executions of Christians, i.e. martyrdoms, than Nigeria.
Okay. I'm going to, there are a couple of other questions here. I'm going to try to get this quickly in. What was the actual state of liturgical practice in the church before Vatican II? And they're asking, I'd love to hear your views on the role of Latin in the church. It seems discussions center on one pole or the other, Tridentine or no Latin at all. Perhaps we could install more Latin in and keep the homilies in the vernacular. Bob, I'll start with you. I mean, that's sort of what Benedict XVI was trying to accomplish.
Yeah, some people who write for us at the Catholic thing and who are advocates of Latin, as I myself am, have pointed to the fact that during Vatican II, a lot of the speeches were in Latin, which not all the cardinals, bishops, etc., at that time understood very well. So some of the problems that we see in the end may have had something to do with that. We've seen in this past week that there's a lot of Latin that is being used as in this run-up to the conclave, and even in the entry into the conclave. And this really puts a question in front of us, because if it's not going to be Latin, which is, you say whatever you want about Latin, it is the historic official language of the Western Church going back to the first few centuries of the Church. Actually, it started kind of in Greek, but moved into a Latin format. But what language is going to be the official language of the Vatican otherwise? I mean, that there has to be some medium in which everybody can discuss. And not everybody speaks Italian, by the way. So, some people have proposed that English should now become the official language, or at least the working language in the Vatican, because it's much more likely that people can handle that than to have studied. They probably have to have studied in Rome to know Italian. But this question is not going to go away. There needs to be a universal language, and either it's going to be the universal language of the old empire, or it's going to be the language of the new empire, probably. And that also touches on liturgical matters, which I'm not going to touch, but I'll leave to the canonist to explain.
Okay, resident candidates, you're up.
So I'll start by...
Don't speak in Latin, though.
No, we'll leave the lingua latina aside. No, I want to endorse what Bob just said. English should be the language of the Curia, and the reason being, it's the language that the largest number of Catholics in the world either speak English as a first language or learned it. So therefore, it's useful. It's not because of Anglosphere domination, just the reality. I mean, we're just following Hollywood and the economic world, French is no longer the diplomatic language of choice. So, and it would be very useful, I would say, because we're never going to recover spoken Latin in the church, and part of the reason is when the liturgy became vernacular, there was no need for priests to learn Latin anymore. So now priests who do learn Latin have a particular interest in it, but there are very few Latin teachers who can go all over the world and spread this knowledge. So I regret that, and maybe that can be revived. And now let's go to liturgy. The liturgical practice before the council is a great treasure and value, and hopefully, we can go back to the John Paul II Benedict approach, which is let both forms of the liturgy coexist and influence each other, because for those who do take the trouble to learn Latin and pray in it, peace and joy come from that beautiful association with the historic worship of the church. For people who go to the new Mass, which is in the vernacular, they've come to learn to appreciate that, and that should be allowed to continue also.
Yeah, that's a great point. And he did try to reconcile the Latin and the tradition of the church with the vernacular, and they do fit together. They can fit and enrich one another. It's a pity that was stopped. Okay, here's a question that came in. I've been getting a lot of these questions, so it's a good way to answer it. Are you going to be live during the conclave? Are you all going to be on site at St. Peter's? Well, I'll take first crack at this. We're all going to be live, but we're going to be at different networks. I'll be on Fox News, Father's on Newsmax. Bob has been bouncing around several different networks. We're doing the world over on Thursday, but EWTN decided not to have us anchor their live coverage. And to be very clear, because I've heard a lot of erroneous things over the last few days, this was not our decision. In fact, we paid our own way to come here to make ourselves available to EWTN. And for whatever reason, they decided to go in a different direction. So unless anybody else wants to chime in on that, I'll leave that one there. Question from down under. What do we laity do if we get a bad pope?
We all head to the backcountry in Australia and pray like crazy. I don't know. Look, this may sound like a flip answer, but every human being is bad to a certain extent. We're all sinners. Every pope is going to have limitations. John Paul wasn't a particularly good administrator. Benedict wasn't either. But they were great men in various ways. What you do is you do what a Catholic does. You go to Mass, you go to confession, you bring your children up right, you practice charity, you keep your faith, and don't allow extraneous, especially in this media environment where every day everything has to be histrionic and dramatic, and it's the end of the world. I mean, our faith is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth, as the prayer goes, right? So if he made heaven and earth, he can probably keep us on the right track, even if there is a bad pope or even more than one bad pope in a row. So be a Catholic. That'll work.
Father, what should the laity do if we get a bad?
Yeah, well, they have to have faith in God and continue to pray, remain faithful to the doctrine of the faith. I'm reflecting back. We had immoral popes in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period, and I can't remember which pope it was, but he made the statement he had illegitimate children. That's the lead into it. He said, all the world calls me father, except my children call me uncle. Because that's how they were explained to the children why they're close to the Pope. Well, he's your uncle, whereas he really was their father. So we can laugh about that. Of course, unchastity is a mortal sin and it's a horrible thing. But we're faithful. I mean, we've had so many problems. The Reformation was a time of great upheaval. Now, the popes, defended the Catholic Church against the Protestant reformers, but many clergy didn't, and they fell in with it. And then, of course, secular rulers persecuted. I mean, here in Rome, we have the Venerable English College, which sent countless priests back to England to be martyred. So, if they could be faithful in the midst of turbulence, we can too.
Yeah. And when you look at the really bad popes and the venal ones, some of whom you mentioned, Father, they did leave this amazing art and architecture. There was something that they were used for to contribute to the ages, even though they were pretty despicable characters themselves. But God has a way of taking care of those people, and he has the final judgment, thank God. The Arroyo Grande Conclave Crew, we'll close it out there. This Vatican edition will continue. Don't miss our next episode. Subscribe to Arroyo Grande Show on YouTube or Arroyo Grande Podcast, wherever you get yours. And this episode is brought to you by our friends at Taylor Fergan Capital Management, Faith, Family, and Finances. Visit them at taylorfergan.com. On behalf of Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, we will convene again, gentlemen. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Rome. Ciao. Arroyo Grande is produced in partnership with iHeart Podcasts and is available on the iHeart Radio app or wherever you get your podcasts.